Well, I want to talk about the naturalistic fallacy. But before I get started on that, I wanted to introduce something to you. This is a human trait profile. Sometimes when biologists are talking about a human trait, they will describe it using kind of a profiling technique, just similar to what, for example, criminal profilers do. And so this profile I'm going to give you is for a human trait. So as I describe this trait, I want you to see if you can figure out what I'm talking about. Okay. It exists in the form of two basic orientations. Over 90% of the population exhibits the majority orientation, while slightly less than 8% exhibit the minority orientation. And there are a few individuals who are equally oriented both ways. Historical evidence suggests that the incidence of the two orientations has been constant for 5 millennia. The percentage of people with the minority orientation is constant across cultures, races, and religions. The trait itself is not externally apparent. The only way to identify a person's orientation is to observe the person's behavior. Throughout history, those with the minority orientation have been forced to behave as if they had the majority orientation, usually through coercion or social pressure. The trait itself is not a behavior. Those with the minority orientation can behave as if they have the minority orientation.
Or the majority.
Oh, excuse me, the majority orientation, yes. Thank you. But the underlying neurological orientation remains unchanged. Neither orientation is a disease or mental illness, neither is pathological. Neither orientation is chosen. Signs of one's orientation are detectable in early childhood, often by age 2 or 3, and some researchers believe that it's defined before birth. Some researchers have hypothesized that the minority orientation is related to prenatal exposure to certain hormones, although recent evidence disputes this. Adoption studies show that the trait is not learned. It's independent of the adoptive parent's orientation. Twin studies show that the concordance rate for identical twins, that is, the chance that both twins share the same orientation, is 50% higher than the expected rate. So the expected rate would be the background rate for the general population. In twins, it is 50% higher, that is for identical twins. What that suggests is that there's a strong genetic component to this. The incidence of the minority orientation is significantly higher in males than females. There is no direct parent-offspring correlation for the two orientations. The minority orientation does appear to run in families in a loose but recognizably genetic pattern. And finally, the pattern shows a maternal effect. The minority orientation in men appears to be passed through the maternal line. So think about that as we jump into this topic here. Think about what trait am I talking about? Okay. So the reason I introduced this human trait is because of a series of emails that we received a couple of months ago, in which the authors of those emails seem to have some trouble understanding why we universally condemn murder, but we regard homosexuality, at least the people involved in this show, as a benign trait. So in this case, the email authors committed the naturalistic fallacy in that they equated the word natural with good or advantageous or some other positive attribute. And they believe that unnatural implies some negative attribute. So let's talk a little bit about some of the quotes from these emails, because they're very interesting here. So one of the authors of these emails says, "Of course there are homosexuals in every culture, but you can't say that because of this fact it's something natural." Okay. And again, he clearly doesn't understand what natural means. I mean, there's actually a definition of natural, which is just, it's present in or produced by nature. That's all it means.
Right, not artificial.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's conflating natural with good or some other. In his case, he defines it as advantageous. Another quote, these guys, both authors seem to have a real issue with defining homosexuality's impact and murder's impact in terms of how many reproducing individuals you have in society and whether these behaviors remove reproducing individuals from society. So one of these is, it says, by being gay you can't reproduce and therefore you weren't able to fit to the theory of evolution at all. English wasn't this guy's native language, so there's a little bit of an issue there, but you can kind of understand where he's going. He did clarify later on. He said his basic claims are homosexuals can't reproduce, not that they don't, but they can't. Because of this, homosexuality doesn't fit with the intent of evolution. I didn't know evolution had an intent.
Right.
Therefore, homosexuality is not natural. Okay. I'll get to some of the inaccuracies in these quotes, but I want to get through these quotes here real quick. Another quote was that homosexuals should be isolated because a society with too many quickly ceases to exist. And, I mean, it's like, okay, you can't catch the gay, guys.
Yeah, and I would love to know what constitutes too many homosexuals.
Yeah. On a planet that's rapidly approaching 7 billion people, even if everything that we've talked about so far were true, that homosexuals can't reproduce or whatever,
right?
Why would that be a negative?
Yeah, we're hardly endangered.
Yeah. And the last one here, homosexuality is not natural, so people who are gay don't act natural. They may act normal, but not natural. If you think this is natural, you can't deny murder is alike. So he's saying that unless I declare that homosexuality is not natural, then I can't condemn murder. And so...
yeah, I mean, he's actually comparing gay with killer.
Right.
I mean, and saying that they're the same.
Because having sex with somebody is exactly the same as murdering them. You know?
If I can just interject something, that it's kind of funny to me because, you know, I've got like an Italian heritage, and there was a series of commercials that came on, I guess it was probably a couple of years ago, from a contact lens manufacturer that was selling colored contacts.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things I remember about this particular, I don't remember the brand, thankfully, because I don't want to name any brand names, but what they were, the commercials were talking, they would show a really beautiful woman, they'd be talking about her beauty, and then they would say, you know, like your lips were as red as a rose, and then they would say, like, your eyes as brown as mud. And so it was like in trying to sell these colored contacts, they wanted to insult people with brown eyes and say your eyes are like mud, because what you really want is beautiful blue eyes, beautiful green eyes. And the reason you would market these contacts to people with brown eyes is why? Because most people on this planet have brown eyes. Right. So you've got all of Asia, all of India, all of the Mediterranean, all of South America, all of every native tribe anywhere. It's there's just a lot of people on the planet with brown eyes. It is definitely the predominant trait. It's a predominant genetic eye color. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that having blue eyes is like being Ted Bundy. You know, I mean, it's just because it's not the common trait doesn't mean it's a non-natural trait, or that it's a trait that doesn't, or that is somehow better or worse. It's just simply more rare. We talked about, I think on the phone, that there's people who are born hermaphrodites. You cannot dispute this person has, like, very, compared to the rest of the population, they have very confused sex organs when they're born. It's not the norm in as far as numbers. But this is not, there was nothing unnatural about the person's birth, about their production, about, I mean, they were born and genetically put together just like anybody else, and something was different about them that made them unique in regard to the percentages of human population. But that doesn't make them wrong or mean that there's something bad about it, or that it's just simply, it was still absolutely natural. It's an absolutely natural human being with a natural birth. And people, I think, just have this idea that if it deviates from the standard, that somehow there's something really wrong with that, or it's suspect. But it's weird because you have these other traits like eye color that nobody blinks twice. Nobody says blue eyes are evil, or having two different colored eyes is evil, or it's like, no, it's simply what you would expect.
Well, and it's interesting that you brought up intersex conditions, because a lot of those are found predominantly in cultures that practice consanguineous marriages, where you've got very closely related people. So you've got lots of first cousins marrying each other, and so a gene for a rare condition suddenly is much more prevalent in this small population of people. And the interesting thing about this is that these small populations are typically held together by some very strict traditional culture or religious belief or something like that, and they want their sons and daughters to marry only within this small group so that they stay pure.
Yeah.
And so, so basically what you're doing is guaranteeing that there's going to be a generation of people that will exhibit some rare...
Yeah, you could break down your genes like that. I mean, really cause some problems.
Yeah.
I've heard, I haven't done any independent research on it or read about it, but I remember seeing a program where they talked about incidence of birth defects in Amish societies is increasing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's true or not. The show seemed pretty reasonable, and it makes sense to me if you're interbreeding on that level. It's almost like when people breed dogs. Mm-hmm. And whenever you have like a specific dog breed, there's always like the known physical problems with the dog. And diversity is a good thing.
Yeah, and they even have a name for it. It's called the founder effect, where you have one individual that carries some mutation who, for whatever reason, has a disproportionate effect on the genetic profile of subsequent generations, either because he's got 25 wives and he's 150 kids or something like that, or in the case of dog breeding, you're breeding dogs for a specific set of traits, and you don't realize until generations later that those traits carry some baggage.
Sure.
So it's it's all good until it's not.
Until somebody breeds something bad.
Yeah. But the interesting thing, because getting to genetic baggage here, some of these quotes about homosexuality were pretty interesting, because it's clear that neither of these individuals that wrote to us knew very much about what they were talking about at all. Because one of those, and there was this assertion that homosexuality implies some kind of reduced fitness, both for the individual and for the population that has a large number of homosexuals in it. And that's not actually true. In fact, it appears that the opposite may be true. There was a recent study that was done in the Public Library of Science 1, and it was about genetic factors influencing male homosexuality. There's actually multiple factors that are associated with male homosexuality, and it turns out that there's this constellation of factors that they also increase a woman's or the man's female relatives' fertility. So what happens is that women who have male homosexuals in their bloodline tend to have more children, and the increase in children from these women more than offsets the loss of children that those males would produce. And they went on to further test this, and they found out that male homosexuals in a family, it not only increases the reproductive rate over time, but in cases where fertility is declining because of other factors, the presence of that sequence of genes actually acts as a buffer for the decline in fertility. So it's one of those things that it might have actually an evolutionary purpose. It could be that homosexuality is a genetic marker for something else that's actually being selected for. So that was one of the items there. The other thing is that these assumptions in these quotes ignore the benefits of kin selection. So non-reproducing individuals are a benefit to social species.
Right, and I think that's an important thing too, is that a lot of these people are confusing the idea of success, like genetic success, and reproductive success
Right.
with individuals. And when you have a social species, the individual genetic reproduction is not necessarily as important. And it's, for example, you'll have something like wolves or dogs where you've got breeding pairs. Mm-hmm. And then you've got like an entire society that's set up just to protect the children of this breeding pair.
Right.
So here you have a lot of individuals that are reproductively accessible, but they're not breeding. And in fact, most of them aren't breeding.
Right.
And just a few are breeding, and yet that's a successful model for, canines. So it's when people start to talk about like, this individual, I could easily look at that model and say, well, all those individuals are not fit. Mm-hmm. None of them are breeding.
Right.
But they have a close kinship with the breeding pair, and their society is built around the cohesion and the support that they offer to one another. And so their influence in protecting the breeding pair's offspring is beneficial to them. And it does ensure the fitness of that particular pack to go forward, as long as the pack survives and the pair continues to breed. And you can interchange that breeding pair. You can like get a new alpha female, new alpha male. That can change in and out, but usually it's just all within, the family, I guess,
Yeah.
the society.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we already commented on that thing about isolating homosexuals would be absurd because you can't catch the gay.
Oh, that's...
I mean, that's just...
Yeah, homosexuals should be isolated. That was very weird
like,
to me.
Where do you think homosexuals come from? They come from straight people.
Yeah, I thought that was extremely bizarre. The phrasing is always, I think, very weird to me. And the word natural, I think, is tossed around way too loosely and without real forethought or without any real consideration to what's being actually said.
Well, and I think you and I were talking at one point, and you pointed out that exclusive homosexuality is a fairly recent phenomenon.
Did I say it?
I think so. Well, it sounds good anyways. It sounds like something you'd say. So,
what did I mean by that?
Well, basically, historically, homosexuals, in fact, I think until maybe the 19th century, there wasn't even a word for it. There was just a word for the behavior, which was called sodomy. But historically, homosexuals in a population have gotten married, they've reproduced, and then they've carried on these extramarital affairs on the side with same-sex partners. So this whole idea that we have today of these exclusive homosexuals in society, that didn't exist probably even 100 years ago.
Yeah, honestly, I know that Greece, they had some pretty open standards.
Sure, yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly how that worked. I know they had mentoring, things where it was involved in mentoring. But yeah, I think the idea of what we had talked about, if I recall right, was this kind of spectrum.
Yeah.
And you said there's a scale.
Yeah, the Kinsey scale.
That talks about, how a person identifies and how they behave. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I remembered from that, and I had just kind of briefly looked into it, the thing that I recalled was the interesting difference between how people identified their sexual orientation versus what they were doing. Mm-hmm. So they would report, I'm having same-sex relationships, but I identify as a heterosexual. I consider myself heterosexual, but I also have these, affairs with same-sex people.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they are confused. I think that they actually identify as heterosexual, but that they have same-sex relationships sometimes.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a big difference between what a person identifies as this is the thrust of what I normally am attracted to, mm-hmm. and yet, I can deviate from that. And
well, and I think that until fairly recently, if you wanted a family, then, there was this heterosexual path that you had to follow for that.
Yeah. Or you adopted a nephew.
Yeah,
or
or
something.
something.
To your estate and raised him.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But until fairly recently, there wasn't this concept of, gay and lesbian families.
Right.
That just didn't exist.
You had the confirmed bachelor and the old maid, and they did not have kids.
And
right.
those two guys, they're just roommates.
Right.
And so I think a lot of people said, hey, I want these things, and, I can get the sex part on the side, with a willing partner. And in fact, there was a guy named Humphreys who did a really influential study, I think it was back in the 60s, and he published it in a book called Tea Room Trade. And if you've never read that book, that's really worth reading. But what he did was he went to tea rooms, which were public restrooms where men who wanted to have anonymous sex with other men would frequent these restrooms.
And see, I would be thinking it would be like a place to get tea. I'd be like, oh, this is not what I thought at all.
Well, they were obviously public
Is this the only
restrooms.
venue? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, wow.
And so, anyway, he set himself up as the lookout in case the cops raided them, because these things were frequently raided by police. And so he set himself up as the lookout, and the guys would come in and they would do whatever they did, and then unbeknownst to them, he was writing their license plate numbers down. And he ran their plate numbers through the DMV and got their addresses. And so, like, 6 months later, he showed up with a survey. And he was just doing some demographic research, and would they like to participate in a survey? And, of course, he was dressed totally different when he showed up at their door, and so they didn't recognize him as this guy that was in this tea room, and who pays attention to the lookout anyway, right? That's not what you're there for. So, anyway, so he gets demographic information. What he finds out is that most of these guys are heterosexuals, they have families, they have jobs, and, their attitudes on a lot of things are just indistinguishable from anyone else, but they have this other life. Yeah. And they go to these other places.
And I want to point out, I'm distinguishing in my head. I'm not claiming that there aren't people who get married in order to try to conform.
Right.
That they are really gay and they're getting married because they just don't want to be found out in society. I'm literally talking about the guy who says, yes, I'm married, I'm straight, or the woman that says I'm married, I'm straight, but I also have these same-sex relationships. Somebody that's openly acknowledging this and saying this is how I identify.
Yeah.
But there's definitely people that I've known who, have a past life where they were pretending to be straight because they didn't want to deal with the prejudice, or because they were suppressing something that later they finally said, I can't suppress this anymore, I can't live like this anymore. And honestly, I just think that it's an absolute, I know it's not illegal, but in my mind, it's an absolute crime to ask people to live that way when what they're doing is really none of my business.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty benign thing for people, unless you're religious and you think that, or like these guys seem to have this underlying fear that if homosexuality increases unchecked, then you're going to threaten human existence.
And honestly, I want to point something out about those quotes. A lot of the email that we get that expresses these sorts of, I probably can't be kind to the statements, but that expresses these sorts of ideas, comes from atheists.
These guys are atheists.
I'm surprised, but I don't want to give you the wrong idea. These are atheist quotes.
These guys are atheists. Now, I don't know, interesting and disappointing as the quotes were on homosexuality, the quotes they had on murder were absolutely frightening. So, listen to this, okay? If murder is in someone's nature, how are they ethically or morally wrong? And again, this is that naturalistic fallacy, because, if this is part of their nature, then it must be good, right? And so, the thing to remember here is that calling a behavior natural doesn't imply any kind of moral judgment on it. So, labeling it good or bad is a moral judgment that we apply after we assess its impact on us.
Right. And that's the thing. I remember on one of the programs that I saw on wild dogs, there was a female wild dog that started killing the pups. And I'm sure that for that dog, whatever she was doing was quite normal. Like that in her head, that was the thing to do, to go kill the pups. But, society doesn't have to accept behavior that threatens society. But the idea of a percentage of the population being homosexual is not the same as going out and killing babies. It's just not the same sort of threat. No one's coming into my home and invading anything of mine, threatening my property, people in my family. Nobody being gay is hurting me at all. And that's, I think, that the big delineation is that they're trying to promote that this is a social ill. And it's really not a social ill. I guess what they're trying to express is, well, if everybody became gay,
Yeah.
then then we would just go extinct or something. Which
And, yeah, and they did express that concern. That
to be honest, I'm not that concerned about it. I mean, if people were to go extinct because they chose to go extinct,
yeah.
I mean, I guess that's our right as a species or something. I don't know. It's not like I'm promoting it or anything. I just want to say that, as far as as long as we're not committing genocide on one another and forcing each other to go extinct,
Right.
if I'm just saying I don't want to have children, I don't really see how some heterosexual couple saying I don't want to have kids is any worse than someone being gay.
Right.
Why is it any less of a choice or less of a capacity? And what if somebody doesn't have maternal instincts for whatever reason?
Yeah.
I mean, is that some crime?
Well, and I would say that if someone doesn't have maternal instincts and they know this up front, that's valuable information, and you should definitely not have children just because society expects you to.
Yeah, I think that's a really bad idea, in fact, to have kids because somebody else expects you to.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is I would see a huge difference between people saying, let's just go extinct, let's not have kids anymore, versus saying, let's start dropping nukes and just killing off all the humans on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't see some sort of delineation between us killing each other versus just saying, I'm not going to reproduce, then there's, I don't even know that there's some common enough ground to talk about it.
Yeah, and we were rapidly approaching this point with both of these guys, because, another quote was, you said that homosexuality is not maladaptive, then neither is murder and nearly any sick attitude humans represent. So, and then finally, the last quote I want to point out with murder was, the guy said, I would point out that murder can be considered an application of the often mistaken maxim, survival of the fittest, or rather a perpetuation of evolution via natural selection, and thus is not in fact a detriment to society at all. While murder has more negative impact on a personal level, especially if you're the subject of that murder, the change to the gene pool which occurs can only be positive in terms of promoting valued traits and removing unfavorable traits. So essentially he's defending murder as a vehicle for evolution, as some type of natural selection.
Yeah, and in social species that wouldn't work.
Yeah, in fact, it's, as you pointed out before, it's quite the opposite in social species.
Yeah, things don't work quite the same. If the survival depends on the cohesion and the strength of a society, you really don't want an individual in that society running around causing insecurity and damage. And that's the difference. It's like going out and causing somebody else damage is not the same as me sitting at home doing something that's no one's business. I mean, I just do not see the correlation there. Well,
and these guys got all wrapped around the axle over the impact that it would have on the gene pool. Because, if you remove somebody's genes from the gene pool by murdering them, then, that's the same as if you're gay. Because you've taken a reproducing individual out.
I guess what I don't get is why don't they see it as the same as somebody who chooses not to have kids? Like, what is the difference why you don't breed?
Or even like someone who is having non-procreative sex. If you ever have sex and use birth control.
But my point is, even if you said I'm going to be celibate.
Yeah.
It's the same result.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at that saying, why isn't there some hatred in our society of people who are celibate or people who,
right.
why don't we have this sort of venom toward anybody that doesn't reproduce?
Right.
You would if that was really your problem.
Yeah. And one of the things I was going to point out on this is that our moral assessment of murder as bad is not based on how many reproducing individuals it removes from the gene pool. So, when we're deciding what to do about a murderer, we don't ask the question about, was this person fertile or not? We don't make any assessment of that. So, that's a complete non-issue. The other thing is they seem to be saying that, murder's natural, therefore it's genetic, or there's some kind of underlying trait. And so there's a couple things I wanted to point out on that. Murder may be a natural behavior, meaning it does occur in nature. We do observe that. However, there's no evidence that it's genetic, for most people anyway, and in fact there's strong evidence that it isn't. And at least it's not a selected for trait.
I think the type of murder
humans.
that we're used to seeing probably is not genetically oriented. I mean, when you talk
Right.
about murder in nature, like even a chimpanzee group, you're probably talking about like some severe aggression.
Right.
Like a severely aggressive individual that just goes crazy, like gets into a fight and then kills another individual, which whether or not they intended to kill that other individual or whether they just intended to harm or threaten, you can't really tell. There's no way
Yeah.
to ask the chimp, did you mean to kill this other
Right.
chimp? But with human beings, the idea of like selectively stalking people, in the case of like a serial killer, the idea of murdering somebody for insurance money, I'm
Yeah.
just thinking that that's probably not a natural trait that you're born with.
Right.
But now the idea of aggressing, like you get into a bar fight, you punch somebody, they go down, they hit their head on the corner of the bar, they die. Or even getting angry and shooting somebody and meaning to kill them. That might be the sort of aggressiveness that I guess there could be some sort of natural aggression that would make a person, just
Yeah.
get really aggressive like that or more, but still anger management works, folks. So,
Yeah.
there is help even if you feel like it's just a natural tendency of yours to get angry, you really can learn to control that.
Well, and one of the things that I'd point out is that murder rates vary pretty significantly across different cultures and different nations. I mean, if you look at the murder rate in the U.S. and compare it to the murder rate in Canada, and if you look at the demographics of these
Right.
two countries, they're so similar, but the murder rates are vastly different. So that tells you right there, there's not
Yeah.
a strong genetic component if there is at all.
That's actually a
For
really
most
good
people.
thing, like what you were talking about
Yeah.
in your profile, your human trait profile. That was one of the things that it mentioned, was that when you do a cross-cultural
Yeah.
examination, you see the rates are pretty similar.
Yeah.
And when you have these things that are deviating really highly within cultures, I mean, you just don't see that many suicide bombers in Iowa. So
Yeah.
it's like, when there's something, going on where it's really big in this culture, it's not really big in that culture, I agree. That's really, an argument for maybe this is culturally derived.
Yeah. And so we get down to the part where, why all this matters. Why does it matter when people commit this naturalistic fallacy? And bottom line is that not understanding this, it kind of underlies this confusion about why we can make these judgments about murder versus homosexuality. But let's take, for example, if we consider murder to be natural, that doesn't mean we have to think it's good. So we can acknowledge that maybe this is natural behavior because we actually do observe it in nature. We observe it in animal species sometimes.
Sure.
So yeah, it's natural, but that doesn't mean we can call it good.
Or even that we have to put up with it.
Right.
Society can say it may be natural, but it's dangerous to society, and so we need to, curb this individual's capacity to hurt us, to
Right.
hurt the rest of us. I mean, that's totally okay.
Yeah, and that's why we remove individuals who commit murder from our society, both as a deterrent for future acts and to remove a known harm from our society. We don't judge murder to be morally wrong because we think it's unnatural. And in fact, that would be the moralistic fallacy.
Right.
We judge murder to be wrong because of the impact that it has on its victims. The number of victims doesn't matter. So if you kill one person or you kill 100, if you've committed murder, then we judge that on the basis of the harm to the victims.
Right, and potential future harm.
Exactly.
And so, also the thing is, if you're judging natural as good and unnatural as bad, I think it was somebody, I can't remember who it was, that said, maybe you should have a hemlock smoothie.
Yeah.
Because there's certain things that are in nature that are not good.
Yeah.
And there's some things, and I'm sitting here with a phone line, 2 computers, a table, chairs, dressed in clothes, got my hair cut, and if I thought that anything unnatural was somehow evil or wrong, I'd be in a world of hurt right now as a total hypocrite.
Yeah.
Because I drove a car here on roads that are paved, and
Yeah.
I live in a completely artificial environment. I'm surprised there's birds.
Yeah.
But
And the people that did this were typing on a computer.
Right. We've got people calling us on a phone line.
Yeah.
And, so natural is not always synonymous with good, and artifice is not always synonymous with evil.
Yeah. So the naturalistic fallacy, when you apply it to human traits, brings its own problems here. Okay. If you claim that something is unnatural, there's this implied assumption that there's some external cause. And if there's an external cause, then you can fix it. And so in the case of homosexuality, this leads to some false assumptions, one of which was that gays have to recruit in order to fill our ranks or something.
In fact, you should look for the gay recruiting station in your area.
Yeah, because I need a new toaster oven.
You get like points. Like green stamps or something.
Yeah. Oh, you didn't know that, right? If you turn a straight woman, you get a toaster oven.
Okay.
Okay.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, that was in the Ellen episode.
That's why you're putting pressure on me. You want that toaster.
Oh yeah, I need a toaster
I thought
oven.
you liked me.
I know. But actually, one guy that emailed us actually suggested that you could raise your children to be gay from birth. Okay. Now, the problem with that is you can't even raise your kids to be straight from birth. So
People have tried.
yeah,
And failed.
Yeah, believe me, my parents tried to raise me straight from birth. Didn't work. And the other assumption is that gays can be fixed, and this is where we get this reparative therapy thing, which it doesn't change a person's orientation at all. It just makes them miserable.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, to me, that's abuse. I just think that's abusive to do that to a kid. First of all, to tell your child that there's something wrong with them when there's nothing really wrong, and then to put that kind of pressure on somebody to not be what they can't help they are, and tell them that it's bad and wrong, and God hates them, and you won't accept them. And I mean, I've always, I don't know, I can't understand the idea of that being your child, and the one thing that's wrong with them is that they're gay, and this is what's freaking you out. I mean, it's not like someone came and said he's, being arrested for serial murders. I mean,
I know, yeah.
It blows my mind that
I know.
people would do that to their own child.
I even have some people ask me, well, what are you going to do if it turns out your kid is gay? I'm like, who cares?
Would you be able to accept him?
It's like what?
You're like, man, I'm counting on it.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do, is raise him gay.
We're raising. Actually, his sexual orientation is fairly apparent.
Yeah, you were telling me about his little story. I don't know how much you want to share about your kid, but that was pretty cute.
If I ask him, if he kisses girls at school, his typical response is a very smug, "Oh yes."
He's the little Casanovini.
Yeah. And so, his sexual orientation is already fairly apparent. So, he's straight. Yeah. Anyway, not that it matters. I don't care. As long as he's happy, that's all we care about. Okay, so at this point, I think you should be getting some idea of why the naturalistic fallacy applied to human traits really has potential to cause a lot of harm. What I want you to do now is have you figured out what trait I was talking about earlier when I gave you that trait profile?
Yeah, we're back to the human trait profile quiz.
Yeah. Okay, so what saith the chat room? Let's see.
What are we talking about here?
Well, I probably can't see.
2 basic orientations, right?
Yeah.
Over 90% of the population exhibits the majority orientation, slightly less than 8% the minority. You see a big correlation between identical twins.
Yeah.
People have been forced to behave like they have the majority orientation throughout history. There's, let's see, slightly higher in males. It doesn't matter if you're adopted. What do we got? What are the guesses?
Well, I think they might have it in here. So
really? Did somebody get it?
Could be, yeah. All right, yeah.
They Googled it.
They probably
You
did.
cheated.
Yeah. Okay, so what does the studio audience say? Handedness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They did get it.
So you guys got it right.
Okay, well they couldn't have Googled it, so
Yeah.
maybe it was that easy. But
Yeah, could be. So anyway, yeah, the trait we were talking about is handedness. So here's what I want you to do.
And by the way, I'm normal. There's nothing wrong with
That's
me.
right. Normal and natural. Okay. So here's what I want you to do, everybody in the audience out there. Using your non-dominant hand, write your name on a piece of paper.
Oh, I don't even have to try. I already know. I'm pathetic.
And
I can't. I'm like useless. My left hand. They could cut my left arm off. It wouldn't. I mean, I don't even think I would be impaired.
Well, if you're like most people, you can manage to get something legible on the paper.
Then I'm not most people.
But the question is, how does it feel to use your non-dominant hand?
Not natural.
Okay, that's right.
Not natural.
Now here's the
It's
other
messed up.
question. Did your hand preference actually change just because you adopted left-handed or right-handed behavior? No, it didn't. So that's the problem here. We've got...
And how much fun would it be to have to use your left hand all the time from now on? What if you lost your dominant hand and you had to use your left hand? How happy would that make you? Not very. It wouldn't make me very happy.
So incidentally, a lot of the things that we talked about, the twin studies, for example, illustrated that there was probably a genetic component to left-handedness. So for a long time, people thought that this was true. And in 2007, some researchers at Oxford University identified a gene associated with left-handedness. So there is actually a gene associated with left-handedness. This gene also influences a person's risk of developing schizophrenia, which validates some prior observations that left-handed people seem to have a higher incidence of this disorder. And this actually raises an important question, and that is, what if schizophrenia is the desirable trait and left-handedness is just the marker? So why would schizophrenia be a desirable trait? There's a guy named Robert Sapolsky who, he's actually a neuroscientist. And he has done a lot of work on some mental disorders like schizophrenia and OCD.
Yeah.
They're associated, schizophrenia and OCD, actually schizotypal personality disorder is associated with people who are highly religious and who have religious visions. And so...
Okay. I mean, yeah, if you're going to hallucinate, I can see how that would...
So
yeah.
these would have been the shamans in primitive society, and this would not have impaired their reproductive fitness. In fact, they would have been highly sought after as potential mates. So it could be that schizophrenia is a desirable trait.
And that's true. I do remember that depending on what culture you're in, sometimes madness is considered desirable, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes it's considered really bad, and sometimes it's considered touched by the gods.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. I didn't realize it was correlated to left-handedness, though.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about the concordance rate for left-handedness, so the concordance rate for left-handedness is 12% in monozygotic or identical twins. Okay. The concordance rate for homosexuality in identical twins is 50%. Okay. So we've got a 50% increase over the background rate for left-handedness. The increase over the background rate for homosexuality in identical twins is over 500%. So what that means is that it's suggestive of a strong genetic component.
Yeah, if left-handedness can be, considered to be demonstrated as genetic by that correlation, and then it goes up that much in homosexuality, yes, that would increase the guess that, yeah, this should be genetic.
Okay.